In an article published in O Globo on the 21st, Miriam Leitao admits that there was a widespread failure in the system of monitoring what happens in the country. One of the culprits is the press itself. We didn't see that the money was too abundant in the PT to be from a legitimate source. Admitting the truth, even if belated, can be a merit, provided it does not come accompanied by new lies intended to beautify confessed mistakes, exempting the sinner from trying to correct them, and even authorizing them to commit those mistakes again with a clear conscience. Miriam begins with a lie in her use of the verb. We didn't see is nonsense. I saw everything, denounced everything, explained everything, wrote article after article, in O Globo itself, warning about PT's criminality. My colleagues responded with disdainful silence, pejorative labels, boycotts, cynical chuckles of superiority, and the abrupt suppression of my column in 3 media outlets. The minimum honesty required of anyone who finally admits long-denied facts is to acknowledge the merit of those who were not listened to when they proclaimed them in time. This minimum is infinitely beyond what one can expect from nearly all Brazilian journalism. Miriam, for example, instead of fulfilling her moral duty to the colleague who paid the price for telling the truth, praises those who were paid to hide it. The Brazilian media, she says, is competent, agile, investigative, independent. If it aired, the implicit conclusion, it was out of distraction, without malice. 4 episodes suffice to show how false this is. 1. When the first clear signs of PT corruption appeared in Rio Grande do Sul, the journalistic class, instead of investigating, went en masse to offer a manifestation of support to the suspect, Governor Olavo Dutra. I denounced this in Zero Hora on December 2, 2001. 2. When Congressman Alberto Fraga claimed to have proof of FARC's financial aid to PT's campaign, many newspapers completely omitted the news. Others hid it in a small corner of a page. See shocking denunciation. When Veja magazine revisited the subject, the rest of the media plugged their ears. 3. When I showed in O Globo itself that a report against the army, which earned reporter Caco Barcelos the press award, was not only false but physically impossible, how did the fine conscience of the journalistic class react? Investigating? Not at all. They promptly gave a second prize to the pseudo-report. See The New Dictators. 4. Finally, the minutes of the São Paulo Forum, and even the very existence of this entity, the most influential political organization in Latin America, whose activities the people had the right and urgency to know to judge national politics, were systematically hidden by all media for 15 years. If they had been publicized, the electorate would never have fallen for PT's deception. The omission by so many journalists before PT's depravity was not an involuntary lapse. It was conscious, persistent, criminal complicity. Political corruption comes from cultural corruption, not the other way around. And cultural corruption is the work of 3 main agents: university, church, and media. Through these 3 channels, over more than 3 decades, a narcotic substance was injected into the people's minds, making them refractory to any denunciation against the left and inducing them to bet their livelihoods, lives, and futures on PT's probity. And there was still enough anesthetic left to numb the crimes of the anesthetist itself. El Mayor. Former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva leads an enviably rich and passionate life, but in one point he has reason to complain. He is the most misunderstood man in Brazil. Never has a figure been so talked about, commented on, analyzed, praised, and scorned without criteria or observational sense, without objective comparisons or appropriate descriptive concepts. Everyone fiercely indulges in the human passion to pile words in the void to get, for mere grammatical order, the voluptuous sensation of having said something important. Among the many theories about the man, perhaps the most foolish was the one that considered him an imbecile. I myself, I confess, was initially tempted to judge him as incapable, a bumbling clown from a slapstick comedy. Like many others, I was led to that by the impression of his between sloppy and grotesque appearance, his populist rhetoric, his hideous football metaphors, and his persistent dyslalia that replaced SS sounds with FF. But no man can be judged by qualities he never cared for. One must measure him by what he tried to do and the results he achieved. And the fact is that, after a difficult start, Lula marched from victory to victory, disorienting his opponents, masterfully coordinating the most heterogeneous groups and the most incompatible interests, until concentrating more power in his hands than any previous ruler, grinding opposition to dust, and turning the entire state into a machine obedient to his party's interests. That was what he wanted to do, and he did it. That was the goal of his life, and it was exemplarily achieved. To his most intelligent and refined detractors, only the pose of feigned disdain remained, a camouflage for impotent hatred. How could such a crude fool have such a spectacular career? The visual impression was undoubtedly deceptive. If they compared the man with real historical figures, instead of stereotyped models of perfection, they would ask, after all, what physical charms or attire did Joseph Stalin possess? What great cultural treasures filled Benito Mussolini's mind? And what's the problem with the SS and FF if Lenin never managed to pronounce the Russian R and his speeches sounded like a child's babbling? With the same intent to disparage what they cannot defeat, but going a little further in interpretive presumption, many Brazilian liberals, those sublime types, were led to classify Lula as a populist because he seemed too uneducated to be a communist. How can you talk about Marxism if Lula hasn't even read a page of Marx? Asked the indefatigable Marco Antonio Villa, who never misses an opportunity to judge what he doesn't know. The embedded premise in that question is that a communist leader must be an intellectual, capable of navigating the mare magnum of capital and delivering erudite lessons on the three laws of dialectical materialism. A type like Plekhanov or Caio Prado Jr. But that is the view of a lay observer. Inside the communist movement, on the contrary, intellectual status was always a handicap, a warning sign of petty bourgeois hesitations. A far more valued credential was pure-blood proletarian origin. Within Brazilian communist circles, crowded with petty bourgeois intellectuals, the arrival of a genuine working-class leader freshly imported directly from the ABC region was a breath of fresh air, a celebration, and a herald of better days. In contrast to Mr. Villa, those who studied communist history might recall the figure of General Fernando Flores Ibarra, one of the top leaders of the Cuban Revolution, intimate friend and trusted man of Fidel Castro, as well as the chief executor of the slaughter of opponents, which earned him the kindly nickname Charco de Sangre, pool of blood. Well, Flores didn't understand a word of Marxism-Leninism, couldn't even read Marx and Engels, and laughed heartily, even bragging about it in public. If one exemplum in contrarium is not enough to invalidate a general model, we might also recall the essential role played, in the South African communist movement, by hordes of workers freshly emerged from tribal backgrounds, whom a historian described as uncultured, but possessing a high sense of communist solidarity. Uncultured, but possessing a high sense of communist solidarity, is almost a literal description of Lula. It was he who, through every kind of internal crisis, managed to create and always preserve the unity of his party, then of a pool of allied parties with no ideological affinity whatsoever, and finally of the entire Latin American left. No activist hearing him say "comrades" fails to feel included in the great solidarity embrace of a vast fighting community. A political leader is not judged by his degree of literary culture, nor by his intimate convictions, which remain forever impenetrable, but by the real historical forces he embodied and to which he indelibly imprinted his personal mark. When Barack Hussein Obama said of Lula, "This is the guy," he knew he was facing the supreme image of Latin American communism. After hearing the reflections of seasoned German communists on the failure of Chilean socialism, Roberto Ampuro wrote, "I became convinced then that the Chilean left had been led by amateur and irresponsible politicians, by affected salon Marxists with verbal incontinence, by ideologues capable of persuading their country to leap into the void, by leaders unable to develop a viable and sustainable project." The very same diagnosis applies perfectly to João Goulart's government. Bravado, hysterical verbal radicalism, inability to concentrate power through alliances and negotiations, precisely the failures for which Mr. Lula cannot be accused. The image that Mr. Villa and his ilk have of the typical communist corresponds precisely to what true communists call a salon Marxist. From this derives a second monumental error in the image they paint of Mr. Lula. Few things in this world irritate me, but one of them is hearing leftists and rightists, always unanimous in their stupidity, say that Lula betrayed his ideals. Some try, with this verbal trick, to save the honor of the left, sullied by the current discredit of the leader. Those on the other side don't even realize they are helping by measuring the Minsaleo chief with the ruler of their own proclaimed values, damaging his reputation, but consecrating those values as the absolute measure of human actions, granting the opponent a lasting ideological victory in exchange for a momentary tactical advantage. In both cases, it is pure hysterical pretense. Neither side reasons from facts or history, but from the impressions they wish to instill in the audience, impressions they first saturate themselves with for greater plausibility. They are not political analysts. They are marketers, interested only in immediate results, totally insensitive to long-term factors. For those reasoning based on the stereotype of communist idealism, a petty bourgeois spirit projection utterly disconnected from the reality of communist parties, it seems logical that if a leftist politician sleeps with big capitalists, he commits adultery, staining the purity of his ideals. In the real history of the communist movement, on the contrary, all idealism is considered a petty bourgeois weakness, and the refusal to make the necessary alliances to concentrate power a mortal sin. If you have 4 enemies, Lenin said, ally with 3 against the 4th, then with 2 against the 3rd, then with 1 against the 2nd. As for intimacy with big capital, Stalin, in the 1930s, advised the American Communist Party to abandon the proletarians and try to win over the hearts and minds of the rich and important. That was what later guaranteed the USSR the influx of American money with which it built its war industry in time to successfully respond to the German invasion. Concentrating power by all possible and imaginable means, including alliances with the class enemy, is the #1 duty of every communist leader. The success Lula achieved by this means is indisputable, and it takes a kind of PhD in idiocy to measure the communist coefficient in a politician's mind with the petty bourgeois moralistic stereotype ruler. Even more idiotic is refusing to call a communist unless he declares himself one. For nothing is more constant in communist history than its persistence in appearing as something else, adorning itself with other names: Popular Front, Anti-Fascism, Third Worldism, Non-Aligned, Progressivism, Laborism, Developmentalism, and the devil. But the ultimate pinnacle of stupidity is to contest Lula's loyalty to communism by alleging he is a crook, a corrupt man. Which great communist leader was not? Who did not live like a nabob while his people ate rats? Which communist party rose to power without bribes, embezzlement of public funds, shady deals, theft, and blackmail? Nothing is more contemptible in communist circles than the petty bourgeois moralism that clings to the rules of formal decency instead of following Marxist morality, according to which good is what increases party power and evil is what diminishes it. Corruption? No one better expressed the communist attitude on this point than the official poet of the French Communist Party, Louis Aragon. We will corrupt the West so much that it will start to rot. No one embodied this purpose better than Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. By the criterion of objective actions, Lula will go down in history as the great savior and unifier not only of the Brazilian left, but of the Latin American communist movement, which without him would have gone to the trash bin in the 1990s, as the FARC leadership aptly observed in a message sent on the 15th anniversary of the São Paulo Forum. Lula may not understand much about Marxist economics, but in strategy and tactics he was the greatest of the greats, an authentic master of dialectical duplicity. He reached the peak with an impressive skill that even Lenin himself would applaud, and fulfilled his role in the revolutionary transition by establishing hegemony, the concentration of political and economic power, and the capture of the state apparatus. Who, in all of Latin America, managed to do more? Next to him, Luis Carlos Prestes and Carlos Marighella were just clumsy amateurs, specialists in failure. Compare him even to Fidel Castro. After a spectacular start, the Cuban dictator, following the fiasco of the OLAS with its guerrillas, shrank to the status of a petty king of a hungry and ragged people. Forgotten by the world, trapped on his island, with all his ambitions for continental revolution frustrated, he would have died in spasms of impotent revolt if Lula had not saved him from isolation through the brilliant idea of the São Paulo Forum, which accomplished precisely what the Generalissimo never managed: to bring to power the communist and pro-communist parties in the main countries of Latin America. It is no surprise that this laboriously built construction began to crumble precisely at the moment Lula left the presidency of the Republic, leaving in his place a genuine bungler, and, weakened by old age and corruption accusations, slowed his activities in the São Paulo Forum to devote full time to the crisis of the local left and his own legal problems. Without him, the Latin American left has its days numbered. All its glories were his work, and without him, it goes down the drain. By far, and in every respect, Lula was the greatest and most effective communist leader Latin America has ever known. The creator and guru of Chavez, Maduro, Morales, and Tutti Quanti, the orchestrator of the unified continental strategy. The right wing never managed to defeat him because it never understood him, and it could not understand him because it insisted on describing him with the journalistic clichés of the day, instead of measuring him on the larger scale of history. In that sense, Lula was, of all the public figures in recent Brazil, the most worthy of respect, not for his moral virtues, which do not exist, but for his virtue in the Machiavellian sense of the term, an iron will allied to a strategic tactical flexibility totally devoid of scruples and capable, for that very reason, of bending history to his will, leading it where he wished, before the stunned eyes of dull opponents who could not even describe what he was doing. Not only on a national scale, but continental, the man who knew nothing of Marxism managed to achieve Antonio Gramsci's objective, elevating his party to the dimensions of an omnipresent and invisible power like that of a categorical imperative, of a divine commandment. No one, in Brazilian or continental politics of the last 40 years, can compare to him in stature, in capacity for effective action, or in the breadth of ambitions realized. Those who turn up their noses to depreciate him are like fleas criticizing the dog that carries them, without knowing where it is taking them. Yes, he deserves respect. At least, it's like in a movie I saw a long time ago, whose title escapes me, in which the local leader of a Mexican village was so feared and respected that everyone called him El Mayor. And only in private, at a safe distance from the tyrant's ears, did they dare to say his full name, El Mayor Hijo de Puta.